I'm Jerry Fort. Welcome to Jungle Jerry's Treehouse. Alright, so this is part 3 of Summer of the Sea Serpent by Mary Pope Osborne. Magic Treehouse number 31, a Merlin mission. We left off at chapter 8, Cloak of the Old Gray Ghost. The 4 seals paddled with ease through the sunlit waters of the Selkie Cove and into the jellyfish cave. The water in the cave was cold and murky, but in his seal body, Jack was warm, and with his seal eyes, he could see clearly. As they swam farther and farther into the cave, the jellyfish began to appear. At first, there was just a few. Then there were hundreds, then thousands. Pink jellyfish, purple jellyfish, orange and chocolate-colored jellyfish, jellyfish as big as umbrellas. As big as umbrellas and as small as pennies. Jellyfish shaped like bells, saucers, parachutes, mushrooms, cannonballs, jellyfish as bright as candle flames, and jellyfish as clear as glass. Some of the jellyfish pulsed in and out as they swam. Others silently drifted by, their long stinging tentacles trailing behind them. As Jack swam among the jellyfish, he wasn't afraid at all. His tough sealskin protected him completely. Finally, Kathleen led Jack, Annie, and Teddy through a narrow passage of the cave and into the milky green waters of the third cove. The 4 seals poked their heads above the surface of the water and took deep gulps of air. Jack's whiskers twitched as he looked around the cove of the stormy coast. The cove was completely silent. It was lit with a hazy, warm light. The water was flat, calm, without a single ripple. Circling the cove were strange green hills that shimmered in the afternoon light. Snow-capped mountains loomed above the hills. Jack could see the tree with the magic treehouse on a distant sea cliff. "Climb onto those rocks and dry off," Kathleen barked. They all swam to a small rocky island in the middle of the cove. Jack hoisted his blubbery, tear-shaped body out of the water. He flopped beside the others and puffed and groaned. The seal body that had felt so graceful underwater now felt heavy and awkward. Jack's skin began to feel tighter and tighter in the sunlight. Almost before he knew it, the skin had slipped from his body like old wrapping paper. He was human again, lying on the rock in his shorts and t-shirt. He sat up and pushed his glasses into place. "That was great," said Annie. Jack looked at her. The same magic had happened to Annie and the others. They were all human again. "Yeah, it was," Jack said happily. He looked around, "And I don't see any signs of a winter storm here." "No, but still I do not like the looks of this place," said Teddy. The boy sorcerer frowned as he peered around at the cove. "It gives me the quivers." Jack glanced anxiously at Teddy. If Teddy was afraid, something must be wrong. Teddy never acted as if he were afraid of anything. "Well, the day wears on," Teddy said, looking up at the sinking sun. "Let us hurry ashore to find the sword, so we can leave this cove as quickly as possible." "I fear our search may be difficult," said Kathleen. "Look." A dense gray fog was rolling down from the mountains. As they watched, the fog hid the sea cliff where their treehouse had landed. Within moments, the fog had completely covered the green hills. Then it swept over the windless waters of the cove. "Oh dear," said Kathleen. "The cloak of the old gray ghost is upon us." "The cloak of the old gray ghost?" asked Annie. "Aye, that's what we Selkies call a very thick fog," said Kathleen. "And that's a line in Merlin's rhyme," said Annie. "Dive 'neath the cloak of the old gray ghost." Jack breathed a sigh of relief. Gray ghost? Wasn't a ghost at all. It was just another name for fog. So I guess we just go ashore and look for the sword under the fog somewhere, he said. The rhyme says we dive, said Teddy. So perhaps we do not go ashore at all. Oh, right, said Jack. Does that mean we get to turn back into seals? Shivering in the cold fog, he was eager to slip back into his warm, protective seal body. I fear we cannot all be seals, Kathleen said. For how could we grasp a heavy sword with our flippers? You and Teddy be the seals, then, and look. You and Teddy be the seals then, and look for the sword, said Annie. Jack and I can swim down and grab it after you show us where it is. Jack was about to say he'd rather be a seal, but before he could speak, Teddy piped up. Excellent plan, he said. Indeed, said Kathleen. Your friends are very brave. She turned and smiled warmly at Jack. Sure, no problem, he said. Let us make haste, said Teddy. Hidden by the fog, he and Kathleen pulled their seal skins back on. A moment later, Jack heard Teddy call out, Farewell, friends. Then Kathleen spoke her sulky spell. Her words were followed by 2 splashes. See this up here? That looks a little suspicious, doesn't it? What do we do now? Jack asked. We wait for them to find the sword, said Annie. I hope they hurry, said Jack, shivering. Me too, said Annie. They listened for the barking of the seals. They listened and listened. I wonder what time it is, said Annie. Impossible to tell, said Jack. They'd better... Shh, said Jack. He heard a faint seal bark, then another and another. But in the thick fog, he couldn't tell where the barks were coming from. Where are they? He said. I think they're over there, said Annie. Splash! Annie had jumped in. Jack couldn't see her in the fog. Annie, where are you? He shouted. Here, Annie yelled through the ghostly mist. Come on. Jack put his glasses down on the rocks. Then he slowly lowered himself into the water. As he started after Annie, his human body felt thin and frail compared to his powerful seal body. He couldn't swim nearly as fast. He couldn't hold his breath underwater for nearly as long, and he was freezing cold. The seal barks grew louder and louder. Bark, bark! Jack didn't see their 2 friends until he nearly jumped into them. Teddy and Kathleen were swimming in a tight circle, barking excitedly. Did you find the sword? Annie shouted at them. Is it here? The seals barked and dove under the water. Jack and Annie took deep breaths and followed. The seals swam quickly to the sandy bottom of the cove. They circled a shimmering object sticking out of the sand. It was the golden handle of the sword. Chapter 9. The Sword of Light. Annie pointed to the sword handle. Jack nodded, but he was running out of air. He swam back up to the surface. Annie followed him. Their heads bobbed above the water, and they gasped. Did you see it? Cried Annie. The handle of the sword? Yes, the blade must be buried in the sand, said Jack. We have to pull it out, said Annie. And we have to hurry. Right, said Jack. He and Annie took giant gulps of air. Then they swam back down to the bottom of the cove. Jack got to the sword first. He grabbed the handle and pulled. Oh, excuse me. The sword didn't budge. He pulled again. The sword still didn't move. Annie grabbed one side of the handle. She and Jack pulled together. Jack felt the sword move a tiny bit. His lungs felt like they were about to burst. Gripping his side of the handle with both hands, Jack pulled with all his might. Suddenly, the flashing blade slipped out of the sand. Jack and Annie carried the sword up through the water as fast as they could. They burst into the air, clinging to the sword of light and gasping for air. We got it, Jack called to Kathleen and Teddy. The seals circled around them, splashing and barking joyfully. Bark, bark! That's what it says. Bark, bark. As they swam, the fog began to lift, and the sky... Oh, wait a minute. Did I miss a page? So after I read, the seals circled around them, splashing and barking joyfully. Bar, bar. The next page has this picture on it, where they're under the water and they're pulling the sword out right there. Okay. Lead us to the rocks, Annie shouted. Jack and Annie each held onto the sword's handle with one hand. Paddling with their free hands, they dragged the sword after the seals. As they swam, the fog began to lift, and the sky turned from gray to blue. By the time they reached the rocky island, light from the late afternoon sun was again glinting off the strange green shoreline. "Hold the sword while I get out," Jack shouted to Annie. Jack climbed onto the rocky island. He took the sword from Annie, then carefully pulled it up onto the rocks and laid it on its side. Annie climbed out of the water. Nearby, Teddy and Kathleen poked up their seal heads. They were all silent as they stared in wonder at the sword. "Wow," breathed Annie. Jack nodded. The mighty sword reflected the burning light of the setting sun. Its blade glowed as if it, too, were on fire. "Now, what do we do?" Jack said. "We have to get the sword to Merlin, fast," said Annie. "The sun's about to go down." "Right," said Jack. "Before nightfall, right?" Suddenly, Teddy and Kathleen barked a warning. Jack and Annie looked up. The water had begun to ripple. The ripples started at the edge of the cove and swelled toward the center. Waves crashed against the small rocky island, sending up great showers of spray. "What's going on?" said Jack. "Maybe a bad storm's coming," said Annie. "Bark, bark!" Kathleen and Teddy tried to haul themselves onto the rock, but the waves pushed them away. "We've got to help them," said Annie. She and Jack tried to help the seals out of the rough water. Their hands slipped over the sleek seal skin, and they nearly toppled into the water themselves. The waves kept rolling and splashing. "Bar, bar!" The two seals were swept away from the rocky island. "Look!" cried Annie. "The land is moving." Jack looked at the strange green shoreline surrounding the cove. It was moving. It shifted from side to side, then slivered forward. A great roaring noise rocked the cove. A monstrous head rose above the surface of the water. The green hills were not hills at all. They were the coils of a giant sea serpent's body. Chapter 10. The Ancient Question. "Ah!" screamed Jack and Annie. The giant sea serpent arched its long neck into the sky. Its scaly green skin glistened in the late sunlight. Staring at Jack and Annie, its eyes burned like bright yellow lamps. Jack and Annie were frozen with terror. The monster opened its mouth. Inside were hideous fangs and a purple forked tongue. The serpent made a terrible hissing sound. Jack and Annie huddled together on the rock. Frantic seal barks came from far away. "Teddy!" yelled Jack. "Kathleen!" "Their magic can't help us now," cried Annie. "They're stuck in their seal. And before she could finish, the sea serpent's deep voice boomed through the cove. "Who are you, and why are you stealing the sword of light?" Jack was too stunned to answer, but Annie shouted back at the monster. "We're Jack and Annie. We're on a mission for Merlin." "Sssss," the serpent hissed angrily. Its purple tongue flicked as it coiled its body around the rocky island. Then the monster arched its neck and lowered its huge head. Again, the ancient voice boomed through the cove. "To be worthy of the sword, you must answer the question of the sword." "What is the question?" shouted Annie. "Sssss," hissed the serpent. It turned away and circled the rocks again. Soon its scaly green body was coiled twice around the little rocky island. "It's going to crush us," Jack thought with horror. Maybe they had strength enough to stab the monster before it squashed them. "Pick up the sword," he shouted at Annie. Together, Jack and Annie lifted the mighty sword. They gripped its handle and pointed the gleaming blade at the sea serpent. "Don't come any closer," Jack yelled. The serpent came closer. Its eyes flashed. Its forked tongue darted in and out. It opened its mouth wide. "Wait, stop," Annie shouted at the sea serpent. "Give us a chance. Ask us the question." The serpent closed its mouth. Then it arched its neck, and its huge head dipped down right in front of Jack and Annie. In a low, deep voice, it said, "What is the purpose of the sword? That is the ancient question." He's big, isn't he? "Okay, the purpose of the sword." "Just a minute," shouted Annie. She turned to Jack. "What is the purpose of the sword?" she asked. "To defeat your enemies," Jack said. Annie shook her head. "That doesn't..." Ooh. Got a cramp on my finger. That's weird. I'd never had that before. Oh. That was weird. "Okay, the purpose of the sword." "Just a minute," shouted Annie. She turned to Jack. "What is the purpose of the sword?" she asked. "To defeat your enemies," Jack said. Annie shook her head. "That doesn't sound right." "To force them to give up," Jack said. To slay them." "No, I'm sure that's not right," said Annie. The serpent hissed at them impatiently. "Then what?" said Jack. "I don't know," said Annie. "But maybe it's not about fighting at all. Look at it." Jack stared at the gleaming sword. Its silver blade glowed against the red sunset sky. Staring at the wondrous sword, Jack felt calmer. A strange sense of joy and relief came over him. "Answer the question," the serpent boomed. Jack's mind became clear. "I think I've got it," he said. "Remember the line from Merlin's rhyme? Answer a question with love, not fear." "Yes," said Annie. "That's it. It's not about fighting. It's about not being afraid." "Answer the question," the serpent boomed. Jack looked up at the serpent's face. As he stared deep into its yellow eyes, he no longer felt any fear. It was the serpent who seemed afraid now. "The sword should not be used to harm anyone or anything," Jack shouted. "That's right," said Annie. "It should be used for good only." The serpent stopped swaying. It flicked its tongue. The sword should not make people afraid," said Jack. "It should help take away their fear. If they're not afraid, they'll stop fighting." The serpent was very still. The purpose of the sword is not fighting," Jack shouted. "The purpose of the sword is peace." Chapter 11. The Sword and Rhyme. The sea serpent moved its head very close to Jack and Annie and hissed a long, whispery hiss. The serpent's flicking tongue touched the sword for a moment. Jack's heart nearly stopped, but then the serpent slowly pulled back its head and began to uncoil itself from around the rocky island. The monster kept uncoiling its great body until once again one wide ring surrounded the cove like a circle of green hills. Then the serpent's head sank beneath the water with barely a ripple. It was impossible to tell where its body started and where it ended. Jack and Annie lowered the sword of light and laid it back on the rock. Then they let out a huge sigh of relief and sat down next to the sword. Kathleen and Teddy poked their seal heads up from the calm waters. "Bark, bark," they barked. Jack and Annie laughed. "It's safe to come out now," Annie called. The seals hauled themselves onto the rocky island. Then they plopped on their sides. "The sword helped us answer the ancient question," said Jack. They all looked at the sword of light. It glowed brightly, even though the sun had slipped below the horizon and the purple sky was fading into twilight. "We still have to get out of here before it's completely dark," said Annie. "I know," said Jack. "But how?" "Look at Merlin's rhyme," said Annie. Jack took the shell from his pocket. He read the last line of Merlin's rhyme. "With rhyme and sword, your home is near." Jack looked up. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "Perhaps it does," said Teddy. Jack and Annie turned around. Teddy and Kathleen were standing behind them. Their seal skins had silently slipped off. They were human again. "Perhaps it calls for a magical rhyme," said Teddy. And I am a magician, remember? Annie laughed. How could we forget? She said. Teddy grinned. I have gotten much better at my rhymes, he said. Just watch. He rubbed his hands together, then he carefully picked up the Sword of Light. He gripped its handle with both hands. He pointed the silver blade toward the treehouse on the distant sea cliff. Teddy took a deep breath. Then he shouted, O Sword of Light, now light the night. Teddy paused. Jack grew worried. Teddy always had trouble finishing his rhymes, and even the ones he did finish never worked the way they were supposed to. Kathleen stepped close to the young sorcerer. Say it again, she said softly. Teddy called out again, O Sword of Light, now light the night. Kathleen finished the rhyme in sulky language. Ma e bree stro e bright. The sword began to vibrate in Teddy's hands. There was a roar and a blast of white light. Shimmering beams shot through the dark. The beams wiggled and waved, then streamed together to make a glittering bridge. The bridge spanned the purple darkness of dusk. It stretched from the rocky island in the middle of the cove to the sea cliff above the coast. When Teddy lowered the sword, the bridge remained in the sky. Wow, whispered Annie. She turned to Kathleen. What did you say to finish the rhyme? Ma e bree stro e bright. Kathleen told her. Make a bridge strong and bright. Yes, that is exactly what I was going to say, said Teddy. Indeed, said Kathleen, smiling. She took Teddy's hand, then turned to Jack and Annie. 'Tis a bright bridge to take from my world back to yours. You mean we can walk on it? Said Annie. Try it, said Teddy. Oh, man, said Jack. He laughed nervously. Then he raised his foot and put it down on the light. It felt solid. He put his other foot on the light and took a step forward. The light felt as firm as a brick pathway. Annie stepped onto the light bridge beside Jack. It was wide enough for them to stand side by side. This is so cool, she whispered. Wait, do not forget this, said Teddy. He carefully handed Jack and Annie the Sword of Light. Together they gripped the handle of the sword. What about you guys? Asked Jack. I must return to my cave now, said Kathleen, or my sisters will begin to worry. And I will see Kathleen back home, said Teddy. Then return to the future in Camelot. After you stay for supper with me and my sisters, Kathleen reminded Teddy. So Kathleen told Teddy before he goes, he's got to have dinner with her and her sisters. Oh, said Jack, he wanted to have supper with the Selkies too. He wanted to spend more time with Kathleen and Teddy, whatever they were doing. We'd better get going, Jack, said Annie. It's almost dark. Okay, said Jack. Goodbye for now, Kathleen said to them. And thank you. 'Tis amazing how you defeated the enemy. The sea serpent wasn't really our enemy, said Jack. He was like the Spider Queen, said Annie. They both seemed really scary until we got to know them. Yeah, said Jack. We will see you again, Annie asked Teddy and No, wait a minute. Will we see you again? Annie asked Teddy and Kathleen. Yes, I have a feeling you will see both of us again soon, said the Selkie. We will find you when we least expect it. When you least expect it, said Teddy with a grin. Now, my friends, you must go. Night comes quickly upon you. Farewell. Farewell, said Jack and Annie. They turned and started walking up the bright bridge. High above the water, the sword's light swung over the cove like a swaying lantern. The water below shimmered with sparkling ripples. Jack heard two splashes behind them. Excuse me, guys. He stopped and listened. Go, 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 whispered Annie. Jack started walking again. He and Annie climbed higher and higher until they came to the end of the bright pathway. They stepped off the bridge onto the rocky sea cliff above the coves. Clutching the handle of the sword, they looked back. The shining bridge shattered into a million pieces of golden light, like the sparks of a firecracker. The glittering pieces rained down through the sky, then they quickly burned out. The cove below was dark and silent, except for the distant barking of seals. Okay, there's like one chapter left, or maybe 2 chapters left. So we'll stop there. Because my lunch is over with, and it'll be a short part, but that's okay. Part 4. We're stopping at chapter 12, the Isle of Avalon. Okay? There we go. Pretty wild. Well, thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And we will see you on the next one.